You're watching Eye on Africa, where we take a look at the top stories of the day from across the continent. Here are the headlines. A change of guard in Algeria as Abdelaziz Bouteflika names a new prime minister, this after recent parliamentary elections. Abdelmadjid Tebboune is the new head of government. He will name a new cabinet on Friday. And a new report says an international arms embargo in Sudan is being flouted and illegally imported arms are being used by the army. We'll talk to the author of that report a little later. And an African at the head of the WHO for the first time, the Ethiopian Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus will take over as Director General of the World Health Organization at the end of June. Hello and welcome. Now to our top story. Algeria has a new Prime Minister, Abdelmadjid Tebboune. The 72-year-old has held several ministries since 1991 and is a graduate of the French Public Affairs School École Nationale d'Administration. He is close to President Abdelaziz Bouteflika. Tebboune was the interim commerce minister since last February. Algeria's economy is heavily reliant on oil and gas exports, but with falling prices, Mr. Tebboune will be overseeing strategic attempts to diversify the economy. Earlier, I spoke to Lamia Ashouch, a journalist who follows Algerian politics. I started by asking her to tell us more about the profile of Mr. Tebboune and what his immediate priorities will be.
First of all, the appointment of Mr. Abdelmadjid Tebboune as Algeria's prime minister has sent shockwaves into Algeria's political scene because very few people expected President Bouteflika to not appoint outgoing Prime Minister Abdelmalek Sellal as the head of the new government following the May 4th legislative elections. Indeed, however, this appointment wasn't so much of a shock because of as you said earlier, the man is very close to President Bouteflika. He's within the president's inner circle, and he has been entrusted to very sensitive ministerial sectors, such as the housing sector, a post he occupied since 2001, and then he occupied it again from 2012 until now, until today, where he was appointed prime minister.
And Lamia, we don't have a huge amount of time, so just a couple of quick questions. How do you expect that he might deal with the very pressing issue of diversifying Algeria's economy, which has been so heavily reliant on oil and gas exports? You have the prices for oil and gas exports massively dropping, which is creating a crisis in the public accounts for Algeria. What can he do to resolve this, and how quickly can he do it?
Well, his background will play a very important role. He is an economy and finance major, so he's expected to make a lot of changes in the country's economy that's been hit by the oil shock. You mentioned before that he was a trade minister. He was acting trade minister since February, and he introduced some very bold policies and laws that have not been met with open arms by Algerians. However, economic experts say this is what needs to be done. His most controversial decision was that he froze import licenses in order to encourage national production and the diversification of Algerian economy. This is something that we desperately need because our economy now is very fragile. We have been hit by the oil prices.
Lamia Ashouch there speaking from Algiers. Now, Sudan has been able to bypass an international arms embargo to import weapons, so says Conflict Armament Research. The UK-based organisation that monitors the movement of weapons internationally says it has evidence that the Sudan armed forces have been using these illegally imported weapons in the Nuba Mountains region. The state has been fighting the separatist Sudan People's Liberation Army in the area for several years. Earlier, we spoke to Justine Fleischner, who authored the report. I asked her about the source of those illegal weapons imports.
The picture in Sudan is a bit complicated because there's a patchwork of different sanctions and arms embargo restrictions. There's an EU arms embargo, which covers the entire country. There's a UN arms embargo, which covers just Darfur. And then there were, until very recently, US sanctions. Now, despite all of these measures that have been put in place to kind of limit Sudan's ability to wage war and commit human rights atrocities in places like Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, Sudan continues to have relatively unrestricted access to weapons and ammunition, in part because the sanctions regime is inconsistent, so it's very difficult to enforce, but also because there are so many different loopholes that the government is able to exploit.
The news comes, Justine, just a few days after heavy fighting elsewhere in the country, in Darfur, and President Omar al-Bashir says that rebels there were using armoured vehicles provided by Egypt. Now, that would also be against embargoes, but Egypt denies that claim by the Sudanese president. Is this possibly another example of arms embargoes not being respected, so both by rebel groups and the government?
Sure. I mean, there are long-standing patterns with regards to Sudan circumventing international arms embargoes and international human rights and humanitarian law, not just in Darfur,
so
but
these arms embargoes just aren't working, right?
Well, you have to think about what are European and international policymakers trying to accomplish. Because of the patchwork nature, they're incredibly difficult to enforce. When Sudan accesses weapons and ammunition from China, that it imports, that in and of itself is not an arms embargo violation. But if it ships those weapons and those ammunition into Darfur, for instance, that would be a violation.
The World Health Organization is soon to have a new Director General. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus from Ethiopia won the most votes from 186 member states. He replaces Margaret Chan, who will step down from her 10-year post next month. Dr. Tedros will be the first African to head up the WHO. Nicolas Germain has more.
Dr. Tedros Adhanom was warmly congratulated by his supporters. The Ethiopian candidate will become the first African leader of the influential World Health Organization. On Wednesday, he told the press his priority was universal health insurance in even the poorest nations. He also recognized that the WHO is seriously underfinanced.
The fundraising unit in WHO is really small, be it in terms of number or the skill sets you have in that unit. We need to strengthen the capacity of the fundraising unit in WHO.
Dr. Tedros, as he wishes to be known, is a former health minister and a malaria expert who drew praise for strengthening Ethiopia's healthcare workforce. He backs greater access to birth control. But his critics say he covered up 3 cholera epidemics in his country, an allegation he denies. He's also come under fire for having been part of a repressive government. NGOs and even the US State Department have accused the Ethiopian government of torturing political opponents and gunning down hundreds of protesters. But back in Ethiopia, many welcomed the news of his election.
When I saw that Dr. Tedros was elected, I was very happy. He's an Ethiopian and an African candidate. This shows that Ethiopians can lead international organizations.
The election of Dr. Tedros has made Ethiopians proud. But most importantly, it makes the whole of Africa very proud.
Dr. Tedros will aim to improve the image of the WHO. In 2014, it was accused of fumbling the response to the Ebola epidemic. And a recent report by the Associated Press said it spent more each year on employees' travel than on fighting major diseases like AIDS and malaria.
To Mali next, where our correspondents visited the Kai region in the west of the country, where emigration is cultural and has always been encouraged by families. Emigrants, for their part, finance the bulk of infrastructure in the region with the funds they send back home. This report by Anthony Fouchard and Emmanuel Londé.
Up until the end of the 19th century, slaves crossed the threshold of this door of no return in Mali, headed for Senegal. Today, Malians are free and their departure voluntary. Migration has always been encouraged in this region. Those who make their fortune abroad support their village back home.
At least 90% of the schools, hospitals and water infrastructures have been built with money from the migrants.
This petrol station and its staff is entirely financed by Malians living abroad. Conscious that the government isn't able to help them, they're developing their region themselves. The same goes for this clinic, which cost nearly 120,000 CFA francs.
In Mali, we do not have enough funds. The government cannot send funds to the entire country. So people take matters into their own hands. Communities organize themselves to take care of their health.
After several years in Europe, Bakary returned to Kai. First, he opened this petrol station, then this money transfer office. According to government statistics, the Malian diaspora sends 21 billion francs back home annually. some of which passes through Bakari's money transfer branch.
All of the agencies in this zone receive a lot of money, around 100,000 euros a month.
That comes from the diaspora?
Yes, from the diaspora, everywhere in the world.
Today, there's no El Dorado for Malian migrants anymore, as was the case in the 1980s. Keeping young people in the region has become a necessity, especially to develop and exploit its natural resources.
That's all for this edition of Eye on Africa. Stay tuned, more news coming up in just a couple of minutes' time.
You love watching France 24 in English.
Analysis from France 24. I'm Mark Owen. These are the main world news.
To the border with Algeria.
Huge lines since this morning to answer that question. But France 24 is also available in French.
14h à Paris, bonjour à tous, bienvenue si vous nous rejoignez sur France 24, préparez-vous.
And Arabic.
Also coming up.
Featured on cable and satellite systems and online media in France and across the world.